Hi everyone, and thanks for joining me for today's episode. I gotta admit that I'm quite excited about today's show because I specifically watched, and I'm going to discuss this next movie because so many of you in the comments actually suggested that I watch it. The Beast Within. According to some of the comments that I read, this 1982, let's call it werewolf horror movie, is one of the genre's greatest. You suggested that I watch it because of, and I quote, its truly terrifying atmosphere. It's apparently one of those films that really get scary atmosphere right, and it's one of the reasons why I was keen to watch it. You said that it's a werewolf movie, and as you know, if you do watch this channel, I'm a massive fan of werewolf horror movies. In fact, the Wolfman, probably my first favorite superhero rather than, let's say, Batman or Superman. And also, to be honest, I've got to say that I like Hollywood's general take on the werewolf legend. So thank you for the suggestion, please keep them coming, and let's find out if The Beast Within is a horror movie that we should watch, skip, or is it one of the rare horror movies that should actually be placed up there in the upper echelons of the genre? Is The Beast Within a horror movie that should be treasured? I think my biggest takeaway from The Beast Within is that it is one of those proud and true B-grade horror movies, and I really like the fact that it kind of wears its B-grade badge proudly. It does, in my opinion, what a lot of the more flashier, safer, mainstream horror movies are simply too afraid to do. And The Beast Within is insanely violent with over-the-top levels of gore, and although those particular elements aren't what usually attract me to the genre, in this case I actually appreciated it because it wasn't like the film was trying to be controversial with all of its gore and violence, but rather that it was celebrating this particular aspect that we've come to expect from horror movies. It also made the film more ballsy and uncompromising. Unfortunately, I've also got to say that I think The Beast Within bears a lot of the failings that we see in B-grade horror movies, and particularly the type of B-grade movies that came out of the 80s. Directed by a man who is absolutely no stranger to the werewolf genre, Philippe Moreau would later go on to direct not one, but two sequels to Joe Dante's classic werewolf horror movie, The Howling, which is one of my favorite horror movies, if not movies of all time. And personally, I actually like the two sequels too. I thought they were pretty cool, especially as B-grade horror movies. Now, The Beast Within itself deals with a couple's son named Michael, who begins exhibiting some alarmingly strange behavior after he turns 17. Now, although I didn't think that the film's comedic edge always worked, a lot of you that suggested I watch The Beast Within praised its terrifying atmosphere, and I 100% agree with you on that. I mean, this film has a really dark, wild, kind of sinister feel to it that I thought was best displayed in its incredibly good opening scene, and I don't say that lightly. It is honestly one of the most unnerving opening scenes that I've seen in any horror movie ever. As for its opening shot, I mean, its opening shot should be a staple to any werewolf movie as far as I'm concerned. This ominous music playing over a slowly rising full moon. I mean, can you open a werewolf movie in a better way? I don't think so. Some might say it's cliched, I personally say that it's classic. And speaking about the music, I mean, this film's 80s horror score, and I think it was by a swing aficionado named Lex Baxter, and it is one of this film's unsung heroes as far as I'm concerned, because it really accentuates the movie's true strengths, which are its tension and its atmosphere. Something that wasn't mentioned in the comments, which I'd like to speak a little bit about now, are this film's performances. I mean, these are performances that you don't often see in B-grade horror movies. I mean, Ronnie Cox, legend amongst legends, star of films like Deliverance and RoboCop, B.B. Besh and the film star Peter Clements. I mean, they're really great in this, and they give this film a true thespian punch. And I kind of hope that they took this movie because of their love for horror movies rather than, say, because they needed to pay the mortgage, as some critics claimed was the case. After this film's sinister and delightfully trashy atmosphere, and I mean that as a compliment, I think that the performances are also a highlight. Now, something else that I personally liked, and I simply got to mention it, even though it's a small, insignificant thing that's probably neither here nor there, is the college jacket that Peter Clemens wears in this film. Again, I don't know if this was a deliberate thing at all, but I do kind of wonder if the actor and the director chose that specific piece of wardrobe as a subtle nod to Michael Landon's 1957 werewolf classic, I Was a Teenage Werewolf. Now, before I get to my favorite scene in the movie, one scene that I've got to mention because it was simply hilarious and probably the only real moment in this film where I thought the comedy actually worked is a scene where Michael is making out with his love interest in the woods when the family dog saunters into the scene carrying a severed hand in his jaws. I mean, I literally laughed out loud. Now, if there's one reason to watch this film, in my opinion, it's not just the top-notch performances, the great score, the violence and the gore, which is all great, but it's this film's absolutely terrifying opening scene. And like I mentioned earlier, I don't say that lightly. Ronnie Cox and Bibi Besh are driving through the woods at night on the way to their honeymoon destination when the car breaks down. Ronnie Cox's character goes in search of help, leaving his young wife in the woods alone. A few moments later, she is attacked and raped by some kind of man-beast creature. It is a scene that is chaotic, it is frenetic, it's at times dreadfully quiet, and you never really see the beast, you just get flashes of it, but through the sound effects and Bibi Besh's absolutely terrified reactions, you get a sense of how wild, ferocious, and simply brutal this creature is. Even now, some 40 years later, it's still an unnerving scene that absolutely shakes you, or at least shook me, right down to my core. So when you guys said that this was a horror movie, it was after the opening scene, which I thought was the film's scariest scene, that I knew you were not joking. Now, although I would love to say that I adored the film as much as some of you did, I can't honestly say that I did, and I think part of the reason lies in the film's overall execution. It's speckled with these great scenes, but it's what happens in between that really put me off a little bit. You have to sort of go with the film's flow and not ask too many questions of its plot to really appreciate the gifts that it offers, namely the exploitation level of violence and gore, the Southern American brooding horror atmosphere, as well as the other elements like the performances and the score. All of that is great, but it's not really held together by a strong enough plot. Again, just my opinion. Another thing that I found was that at places in this movie, it was unintentionally funny. And that kind of really pulls me out of a movie. Again, maybe I'm not getting the humor if that's what's meant by it. For example, I mean, the dog scene was intentionally funny, but some of the dialogue in this movie just felt lousy and kind of clanged in my ear. And I found this to be the case more often than not in the movie's sort of emotional, intimate scenes, like where Michael is trying to woo this girl and he says things to her like, "You're so beautiful. Has anyone ever told you that? Do you have a boyfriend?" Again, that just sort of clangs in my ear. It took me right out of the movie at places. I couldn't quite figure out, is this the film trying to be funny? Is it meant in a tongue-in-cheek sort of way, or is it meant earnestly? In the end, to me, it just sounded a little bit naive, and I thought that maybe those scenes could have done with a rewrite. Okay, so how scary is The Beast Within? Based purely on its opening scene, which I feel is effectively one of the scariest scenes that I've seen in a long time, The Beast Within scores a seriously violent axe on the meter of fear. So the lowdown on The Beast Within. This film has that classic werewolf premise, which is one that I love. A cursed man that is now compelled by his carnal instincts to go down a tragic path of rage and violence. The Beast Within is basically an updated, riskier, grimier, more exploitative version of the Wolfman. Yet, even though this movie might be a werewolf story at its core, it isn't one on the surface. I kind of felt that the title should probably have been The Fly Within, since the creature that he is turning into is less lupine and more insectile, and bears a stronger resemblance to Cronenberg's The Fly than, say, Dante's The Howling. Speaking of the transformation scene, which is another staple in these kinds of movies, in a lot of those movies, the werewolf transformation scene is one that is kind of slick and stylish, but in The Beast Within, it is something completely different. It is ugly, it is even disgusting, it is stomach churning, that's very effective, and one that I kind of appreciated. Now, although I didn't really enjoy this film's dialogue and its overall handling of the plot, as I mentioned, and I also think that the film's writer Tom Holland, who would later go on to direct the brilliant Fright Night, kind of felt the same way when he said that he'd be interested in doing a remake of The Beast Within, because he felt that the original didn't quite capture what was in the script. And by the way, speaking about that remake, it is apparently still on the cards, so that might be an interesting thing. Having said all of that though, I do agree with you. Honestly, I do agree with you that this film is an overlooked and underrated gem that really exemplifies horror atmosphere. I also think that this film embraces its trashy, ultra-violent instincts, and it creates a genuine, palpable mood that I simply feel is lacking in a lot of horror movies today. So The Beast Within is the B-grade horror movie fan's ultimate movie. If your love for this genre lies in the exploitation realm where atmosphere, insane violence and gore is given precedence over slick plotting, PG ratings and popcorn style horror, then this movie is definitely for you. Now, watch it, skip it, or treasure it. I would say definitely watch it. Certainly don't skip it, but I don't quite put it in the treasured realm that some of you do. However, I will also say that I really enjoyed watching this movie for its trashy exploitation B-grade horror movie charm, which it has in abundance. So thank you so much for the suggestion. I really did enjoy watching The Beast Within, and I feel that it raised my horror IQ up a little. So feel free in the comments to suggest any further prescribed watching for me. I will certainly get to it and maybe even do an episode of it if I get the time. Next up for me though is another 1982 horror movie. I'm getting into my 80s horror. It's like I mentioned in a previous episode, it is uncharted territory for me. So the next one for me is a movie called Alone in the Dark. Have any of you seen it? If you have, what do you think? Should I watch it? Do you think it's worth checking out? On that note, thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. I really enjoyed doing it and jumping into this movie, and I really hope to see you next time for another episode of Den of Horror. Stay safe, stay happy, and most of all, stay horror. Cheers everyone.